everybody. Today's class is going to be dedicated to the lower back and hips, more specifically the lower back, but when our hips are immobile, it tends to translate into the back. And sometimes when our back is really hurting us, it can translate tension down into the hips and pain down into the hips and legs. With this practice, it's going to be a little more slower and stretchy with a little bit of strengthening elements as well. We're going to use a rolled up towel or a thinner rolled up yoga blanket. You can see here, I'm using a yoga blanket, but I've only rolled up about not even halfway because I want this roll to be pretty tiny. Later on in the practice, we're going to bundle that all up into a belly roll. But if you have a corgeous ball at home, if you've got one of these guys at home, then I would suggest that, because we're going to do like a modified abdominal massage to relieve lower back tension. But I know the majority of you are not going to have one of these, but if you do have one, you're going to get more out of the practice with the corgeous ball. But I'll show you how to use a blanket or a couple towels. You might want to have 2 towels on hand for the belly work. I am going to use a bolster as well later on in the practice, and for that it's going to be under the hips. So if you don't have a bolster, you could use a stack of towels, so about that high. To get started, we are going to have our little roll, and you can see it's not a very big roll, but it is dense. I don't want it to be really squishy because I do want it to give just a little bit of lift in my pelvis. But so if you have a Mexican blanket, one of the more squishier Mexican blankets, like a big one, that's probably not an ideal blanket for this. So go to a towel if that's the blanket that you have at home. So I'm just going to take this right into the center of my mat. And before I lay down, I'll just show you where I'm going to place it. I'm going to place it just above the tailbone. So not on the low back and not all the way down on the actual tailbone, but just above the tailbone, right at the bottom of your sacrum. And what we're going to do is use that very subtle back bend and the breath to begin to open up the lower abdomen. Okay. So coming down, you could wiggle your bum up nice and close, hold on to the edge of your roll. And then if you're sitting on your bum, when you lay down, yeah, it's lining up in a pretty good spot for me here. Now, if you have any amount of considerable back pain at all today, you're probably going to be better off to just be flat on the floor here. That little bit of a back bend is going to be better for you. But if you have sort of chronic tension in the back muscles, then this should be a safe option for you. So begin to let the back of your sacrum rest heavier onto that blanket roll. And allow the tailbone to sink towards the floor. So I'm letting my bones be nice and heavy on the support. I can feel that roll at the very back of the pelvis. You'll get a little bit of cosmetic pain here. It's, where it's kind of digging into the back of your pelvis a little bit, but shouldn't be very bad. But if whenever you lay down after, say, 30 seconds or so, if you still have any amount of low back pain here, then come off and just go straight on to the floor. And beginning to slow the breath down. And taking the breath all the way down into the lower belly and expanding the lower torso in all directions as you breathe in. And softening everything back towards center as you breathe out. And slow, steady breath in. And a complete exhale. Continuing to breathe here. And so you may be wondering why this subtle roll, why this shape in the back. Oftentimes when we have to sit for long periods, we begin to slump into the low back. And certain parts of the lower back, when we use a larger prop, we might get more extension in the back coming from parts of the back that are already very easily move into extension. Whereas if we're using this little tiny roll that's a little more focused, it's not going to create so much effort in the body that that will compensate. So with this little roll, we can approach this back bend in a little bit more of a gentle way, and then use the breath to soften all of the tissues as we breathe. And just take these next couple of breaths to really focus on the softening in the abdomen on the exhale. So not at all trying to draw the belly in a contracting way. You're just allowing the belly to soften back towards the spine as you exhale. And from here, just exaggerating that extension a little bit more by dipping your tailbone towards the mat, so you're creating a little more of a contraction in the lower back muscles, and then rounding your back towards the floor. So we're doing our pelvic tilts, but just on this subtle roll. Rocking the hips forward and back. Looking for an inhale as you tip the pelvis forward and arch the lower spine. And an exhale as you round the lower back towards the floor. Very subtle tilts, and then pausing in your neutral. From here, walk the feet a little wider than the hips, and then begin to just shift the weight of your hips from side to side. So you're not going into a full windshield wipers. Right now we're just shifting the weight from the right hip to the left hip and allowing the legs to sort of follow along as we move. You might get a little bit of a bonus hip massage if your roll is a little wider than your hips. And as you shift your weight from side to side, and see if you can, again, allow the belly to soften so much that it begins to hollow back towards the spine. And the more you allow that hollowing action to happen without effort, you'll begin to maybe notice some subtle stretching sensations in the belly. Working towards getting some of those hip flexors and abdominal muscles that might be stuck in a bit of a shortened shape to just slowly open up without jarring the nervous system, not going into our deepest stretch. My legs are going to sway a little further from one side to the other here. And begin to make that swaying action just a little bit smaller. Slowly allowing the legs to make their way back to center. Coming to pause, you could walk your feet in a little closer to your hips. And then lift your hips up, pull the blanket out, and just set it off to the side, but keep it close by. We'll be using it again in a moment. And then give your back a moment to settle back towards the floor. You might notice, we didn't do a real assessment or anything in the beginning, but you might, knowing how your body feels when it lands on the floor, you might notice more of the back spreading out, the tissue spreading out on the floor. Not that you want the spine flattened into the floor, but create a little more contact with the surface. Coming back into the breath, slowly breathing in, filling out the belly and the lower ribs. Exhaling, allow the ribs to soften and the belly to hollow. Two more breaths here. And then from here, keeping the left foot on the floor, you can cross your right ankle over your left knee. Press the right thigh away from you. You can use the strength of your hips to do that. We are going to take the hands onto the thighs in a moment, but just take a moment to gently sway the legs from side to side with your ankle and knee connected. We already did a little bit of this motion, so we can start off going a little bit further than we might normally start. Begin to just sway the hips towards the floor, not letting anything land just yet. And then as you're moving from side to side, just begin to assess what your back is doing here. So as I sway my legs over to the left, how does it feel? Is there any gripping or holding that's happening? Is there a nice big stretch? Maybe you're not feeling much at all. And then same thing with as the legs shift over to the right, and just seeing what happens through the left outer hip here, feeling for any excess tension in the back. If there is any, then back out of it just a little bit. Coming back through center and all the way over to the left. This time we are going to let the right foot land on the floor. You can reach down for your left ankle, hanging onto the ankle. Slowly breathe into the right side of your waist and hip. Doing your best to soften anything that is not needed in this shape. So if you're holding tension in the jaw or the face, shoulders, maybe even the fingers and toes, see if you can relax those regions of the body. Maybe let the teeth part just a little bit. Releasing the ankle, roll your legs back to center. Take a moment to pause here. Let the back reground onto the floor. Take a breath in and a full breath out. And then draw your right knee back towards your right armpit. Reach out with your right hand for the outside of your right foot. Holding on to your foot, pull back on the foot like a bow and arrow. If this is not happening for you today, you could grab onto your pant leg. You could grab onto the back of your thigh, or you could use a strap to get into the same shape, or a towel. So holding on to the right foot. I'm just being gentle with it today. I'm not creating a lot of push-pull through the hand and foot as I normally would in this pose, because I'm trying to be a little gentle with my body and with my nervous system. So I'm not forcing anything. Finding that nice, slow, expansive breath. Imagining the entire circumference of your torso expanding as you breathe in and narrowing as you breathe out. And slowly releasing the sole of that right foot. Let your right foot come to land on the floor. Take a little pause, assess how you feel from one side to the other. Assess how you feel from right to left and also from top to bottom. We haven't done a lot of work through the shoulders or neck, and just maybe notice, are they still feeling tight or rigid or restricted, or any of the things that you might come onto your mat to relieve. And if they are receiving a lot of tension, can you maybe give your shoulders just a little wiggle or a shake? Let your whole spine move to just let go of any rigid holding pattern you might have there. And then crossing the left ankle over the right knee, starting off with a larger sway about halfway, going towards the floor but not landing just yet. Shifting the body from side to side. And as soon as you start moving, you can just start assessing and seeing how you feel. And the reason I ask people to do that a lot is because we can really start to be our own caretakers. You know, a lot of times when we might go to a doctor or a physio or a massage therapist, as soon as we feel, you know, a big bad pain that we wake up with. But if we get to know the sensations in our body and the restrictions in our body on the day-to-day when we're feeling good and paying attention to those sensations, then we can usually figure it out and connect with our body in a way that it's going to let us know when, you know, a back flare up or a neck problem or knee problem or any of those things are coming on, unless it's an acute injury, you know, from an accident or something like that. But if it's a chronic thing and you really start beginning to pay attention to your body, and then when you are starting to not feel so great, you can get down on the floor and do some movement to try and soothe your body back to its version of normal or homeostasis. So the next time you sway your legs over to the right, you can let the sole of your left foot come down to the floor, grabbing onto your ankle if it's available. You don't have to grab the ankle if it's not. And slowly expanding the torso as you breathe in. Relaxing deeply into the floor as you breathe out, letting go completely. So coming back to that, getting to know your body and its sensations to read into. I've been doing a lot of physical activity this week, and because of that, I can feel right now. Now, my left hip is naturally more restricted. It's always been a little bit tighter than my right, but I can feel a big difference today. Like my foot doesn't want to land on the floor, where normally my foot would land on the floor, no problem. But I'm getting a ton of messages from my outer hip here. But because my body is used to stretching and I'm not forcing it into any shape, I can breathe with this level of sensation. So another thing about really practicing that inner awareness, proprioception, interoception, when we begin to practice those things, we begin to recognize what it is we might need to do to work with those restrictions, to keep that part of the body a little happier on a more regular basis. So if I had let this go and not noticed what was happening through my hip, and then in a few weeks' time I overdo it a little bit physically in some way, this could come back to bite me a little bit, but because we're checking in and working with our sensations and our tissues regularly, we have a little bit more control and a little more say in those bodily responses. And that's not to say that, if you throw your back out, it's your fault or anything like that. But if we're paying attention, which is a huge part of yoga, if we're paying attention, our body is our greatest teacher. And when we listen to it and honor what it's asking of us, we can save ourselves a lot of pain and discomfort. Releasing the grip of that left ankle, roll back to center. Pause here just for a moment. Let the back settle. Let the waistlines almost widen as you breathe in. And soften as you breathe out. From here, drawing your left thigh back towards your armpit, reach up for the outside of your foot with your left hand, grabbing onto the foot, gently pulling back towards the floor, but then I'm just kind of letting gravity and the weight of my arm do the work. I'm not forcing. And then coming back into the breath. Another important thing about paying attention to our body is that it's going to inspire a lot of curiosity as you really begin to notice just how different your body is from one side to the other, from top to bottom, from day to day, because one day you might feel supple and raring to go and like you can achieve anything. And then another day you might feel like you can't balance on 2 feet, let alone one, and that cool pose you did yesterday is completely out of your wheelhouse today and everything. So then you start to wonder why, and stay in tune a little more. It can be the inspiration to do a little bit of research on, well, what muscle is that, or what does the hip bone really look like, or that the bones that make up the hip really look like. And the more your visual map of your inside body, the more you understand what things look like on the inside, the easier it is to do yoga. I was really lucky that I had a teacher very early on that really inspired me to buy a book on anatomy and study it. Long before I was ever a massage therapist, and then another Pilates teacher who would often call out the names of muscles and talk about the attachment points and things as we were using those muscles, because it creates this visual for you, so that you can use that imagery to help your body move and feel a little bit better. And take one more big breath in, and a full sigh out. Releasing the sole of your foot back onto the floor. Take a little pause. Walk your feet a little wider than the hips. Let your knees knock in towards one another. Bring your hands onto your belly for a moment. You could have your thumbs onto the lower ribs and the rest of your hands on your abdomen. And then take a slow, steady breath in. And a complete exhale. As you're breathing here, just notice the lift and lower of the belly into the hands. Anytime you have these moments of pause, and I'm intentionally pausing a lot more in this practice to give your nervous system a break. Whenever you have those moments of pause, if you can find something to focus your energy on, whether it's the sound of your breath, the feeling of your breath, even the taste of your breath, or the smells you're smelling. You could use your visual cortex to imagine that lift and lower of the belly, anything like that you can focus your mind on. You're going to allow the body to then relax and get out of that cyclical thinking that we tend to quickly move into, that default mode network that our brain goes into when we're just kind of hanging out. But the more we can stay conscious of sensations or smells or sights or anything like that, whether they're internal or external, the more relaxed into this state we can get. And then shifting your hips over to one side, roll onto one side, press yourself up. So I'm going to take my blanket now and make it into a square. So if you had a towel, you might want 2 towels if they're thinner towels. And then I'm going to kind of start rolling the corners and the inward, and then the bottom corners inward to make kind of a big ball. Doesn't have to be beautiful. And then you can set that on the floor. And this is where you could be using your corgeous ball instead of a blanket, but this will totally do the trick. In fact, this was the first way that I learned how to do this. So I'm going to lay my belly onto the very center. I'm thinking, actually, think of belly button to the center of the bolster or the blanket or ball. So the blanket for me is coming right up underneath my rib cage, and it's almost all the way down to my pubic bone as well, which is a nice broad surface. And because I was doing a lot of squatting and lifting, and my hip flexors are definitely very tight right now, what I immediately feel is tension in my abdomen. And for some of you, if you've never done this kind of work before, it might make you want to jump up and run away. And the reason for that is the nervous system protecting our visceral organs is not used to this kind of pressure in our abdomen, and it's gonna say, whoa, no, like that's not okay. But if we're being gentle with ourselves, and we should be in this practice, then give your body some time. You could also flatten out the surface of the blanket or deflate your ball if you haven't used the ball in that way in a while, and give yourself a moment and assess. So I'm feeling like no big deal now. So I feel confident to stay on this blanket and breathe into it. If you are still like, oh my God, this is way too much, then really flatten out the blanket or ball that you're on, and then come into the breath and slow the breath down. So as you're breathing here, you want to be really breathing into the belly. So inflating your abdomen, feeling the whole torso lift up a little as you breathe in. Now, lifting up just with the breath, not physically lifting your body up. And then as you exhale, really allow your body to sink heavier and heavier onto the blanket or ball. Now, when you do that, you might get a little more sensation. Once again, another breath in, filling out the belly, filling out the lower back. And a complete breath out. Sink, sink, sink onto the ball. One or two more breaths here. From here, you could lower your head down onto your hands. I'm going to keep my head lifted because I'm going to get kind of muffly if I lower my head down too much. So I'm going to stay lifted, but please do, if you want to go a little further, lower your head down. And from here, we're going to take a nice, slow, steady breath in. At the top of the breath, hold your breath and contract your belly muscles, like you're preparing for someone to punch you in the gut. Holding that for 5 to 7 seconds. And then a complete exhale, really let the weight of your body go. Another slow breath in. Hold the breath, contract the belly. And a full exhale. Slow, steady inhale. Hold the breath, contract the belly. Complete exhale. Sinking onto the ball or the blanket. 2 more breaths here. Holding the breath, contract the belly. And a full exhale. And from here, you can walk your forearms back, roll off of your blanket. You can just set the blanket or the ball off to one side. We're going to come right back onto the back, just for a moment. And then just seeing how you feel, letting your low back settle. And then from here, walking your feet in close to your sit bones, but not pulled in as tightly as possible. Give yourself a little bit of wiggle room for the knees, keeping your feet about hips distance. I'm going to grab onto the outside edges of my mat. Pretend I'm pulling the mat apart and then walk my shoulder blades underneath me just a little bit until I arrive on the flats of my shoulder blades. You can still hang on to the mat here if you like, or you can plant the palms firmly onto the floor. Knees, ankles, and hips are staying in a line. And then from here, honoring the natural curve in your low back, find a little bit of a squeeze of your front ribs towards your front hips, but without jamming your lower spine down to the floor. And then from here, you're just going to lift your hips up a little bit. Hanging out here. Not putting a ton of effort into this tiny little bridge pose. Trying to honor the natural curve in your lower back. Begin to notice if one side is working a little harder or fatiguing a little faster than the other. That might be the side that your body needs to strengthen in order to resolve some of this lower back stuff that you might be coming up with every now and again. And then keeping that rib and hip connection, lower your hips back down. Take a little pause. Take a little pelvic tilt, so tipping your pelvis forward, rocking your pelvis back. Sway from side to side just slightly. And then come back to center. Pausing here. Root your hands into the floor, or once again, hanging onto the outside edges of your mat. Lift the hips up a little bit higher. Noticing the muscles that are fatiguing. You're probably going to feel your low back a little. You're probably going to feel your glutes, but you might not feel your glutes. Or you might feel one glute a lot and the other one not at all. It's a really common imbalance in the lower body. You might feel your hamstrings. You probably feel your hamstrings, but you might not. Either way, keeping the feet firmly planted where they are, you're going to try to drag your heels back towards your tailbone. You don't have to lift your hips up any higher than they already are. And just take a couple more breaths here. Lowering your hips back down. And again, give yourself a little space. You could take a little sway from side to side. A little rock forward and back. And then one more time, again grabbing onto the mat or firmly planting your hands and arms. Squeeze and lift the hips up. Find that little connection between ribs and hips to activate the belly a little. Hovering your hips. We're not coming anywhere close to our biggest bridge today. We're really just gently contracting the muscles, because sometimes our low back, oftentimes in our culture, our low back muscles are actually lengthened quite a bit, and giving your body some novel input or some new input of shortening those back muscles might be more pain relieving than stretching them out. And we want to really pay attention to that muscle imbalance if we have a job that we have to remain seated throughout the day. If we've ever had a lift injury where you went to lift something really heavy and you were bent over, that might have been more of a lengthening strain rather than a shortening strain. You're going to want to pay attention to it if you know that you have some, I don't like the word adhesions anymore, but we'll just use the word adhesions or scar tissue or anything like that in the lower back. The reason I don't like those words is because we can't really see what's happening underneath the surface. So we don't really know, is it an actual scarring or nervous tissue, or is it the nervous system resisting the shape that you're in that is causing that tension. And lowering the hips back down. So slightly longer holds. And just assessing how you feel. Give a little sway of the hips from side to side. I'm going to walk my feet just a little bit wider and really get loosey-goosey with my hips as I sway from side to side. Now, if I had acute pain, I certainly wouldn't be doing this. It's probably a little bit too much. But what I am doing is getting into those little sort of nooks and crannies in the lower waistline area, and opening up those tissues a little bit. And just getting the joints moving a little bit. And then coming back to center. Draw the knees in towards your chest and give them a little bit of a squeeze. And a rock from side to side. How does that feel? And then still keeping knees lifted and hugged in, but we're going to press them a little further away so that you're getting a little heavier into your tailbone now. And now, once again, sway from side to side and just see how that feels. Releasing the feet back onto the floor. You can roll onto one side and come back up. I was going to skip this one and put it into another video, but it keeps popping into my mind, so that's a good indication that I need to do it. So grabbing your blanket or your couple of folded up towels again. You can also use the corgeous ball for this one. Probably this width. I'm going to make a roll now. A much thicker roll than we had in the beginning. And put that in the center of your mat. And now I'm going to shimmy my hips up nice and close to the blanket roll. and lay the side of my waist down onto the roll. I'm going to let my head rest on my bicep here. Now, if I got into this shape, first of all, we're all proportioned very differently. If my hips are much wider than my waist, then I'm going to need a bigger roll. And if my waist and hips are fairly similar in size, like a moderate roll, and if you have very narrow hips and your waist is not much narrower than your hips, then you probably just need a little roll. You'll feel it pretty much right away. I certainly do. So this is a nice little passive QL stretch. This big steak-like muscle in our back that is also attached to our ribs. And because of that, we really want to use the breath when we're working with this muscle. Another day I'll bring in an anatomy book and show you guys what it looks like, because it really does look like a round steak. So you're laying on your side. You can have your knees stacked, but you could play around with this top leg. If I am here with both knees stacked, it's a little bit of a moderate stretch. If I lengthen out this top leg, it's a little bit deeper of a stretch. And if I lengthen my arm overhead, it increases it just a little bit. But I don't want to be stick straight with this. I love to work with tension, but for this, it's not going to work. We actually want to let our body sink and get heavier onto the roll and sort of mold around the roll, almost like we're trying to narrow our waist with the roll. If only it were that easy. And from here, I want you to come into your breath once again. So nice, slow, steady breaths in, expanding the waistlines. And a complete exhale. And slow, steady inhale. And a full exhale. Slow, steady breath in. Really feel your rib cage move with that breath in. And the breath out. And then from here, I'm still going to keep that breath moving, and I'm just going to rock back and forward just a little. I'm kind of massaging my QL muscle, your quadratus lumborum, if anyone's curious. Can look that up in your brand new anatomy book that you go pick up from the, I was going to say library, but it's probably still closed. You can look it up online, Dr. Google. Just a couple more little rolls forward and back here. And then stack your leg back on top. Hands come back in front of you. Press yourself up. And just so you can maybe see a little bit more of what's happening in my body on the roll, I'm going to turn my back to you for this one. Just so you might see, it might be a little better to see how much of a curve I'm getting in the low back here. So again, I'm taking the top of my hip bone right up to the blanket and then laying down over top and really letting my hips and my upper body sink into the floor. And if there's a difference from one side to the other when you lay down, like, whoa, this is a bigger stretch, maybe the leg shape changes on this side. So our QL muscle is many things, but one of the things it is a hip hiker. And so oftentimes, say, for example, if somebody had an injury that caused them to limp, even if it was like 20 years ago or more, that hip hike can still be in our nervous system as a pattern, a habitual pattern for our body to keep it. It created that compensation at some point for whatever reason, and nervous system's a little lazy. It takes a lot of energy to do its thing, so it didn't ever go back to its original patterning. So when we have that old patterning in our body from an injury, you might get on this roll right now and feel a massive difference from one side to the other. Also, people with scoliosis, that's another thing I should be talking about here with this too. If there's a lot of hip hiking on one side and lengthening on the other, then it's going to feel really different from side to side. So changing up what's happening in the lower body accordingly. I'm going to lengthen out my top leg and take my other arm overhead, and again let my body sink, and slowly breathe. Expanding the abdomen, the hips as best you can. And then letting everything sink on the exhale. Two more breaths here. And then beginning to press yourself up. Coming off the blanket roll, you can set that off to one side. And then coming on to hands and knees. Coming to have hands under the shoulders, knees underneath the hips. Finding a nice long spine. And then wag your tail to the left. So this is a QL action, that hip hike, except that we're in a quadruped position rather than standing up on our feet. So wagging your tail to the left, look to the left, shortening the left side body. And then slowly lengthening the left side body as you wag your tail over to the right, look to the right, squeeze the right side, lengthen the left side, and then come back to center. Take a little pause, take a breath in, expanding the belly, and a full breath out. One more time, we'll wag the tail to the left, look to the left, really squeeze the left side. And then slowly coming back through center, head and tail moving simultaneously, and then the right side squeezes. Take a peek back at your tail. And then coming back to center. Take an inhale, lift up through the tailbone, lengthen the belly, and draw the shoulders down the back. Exhale, tuck the tail around the spine, press the floor away. Inhale, lift up through the tail, lengthen the belly, shoulders draw away from the ears. Exhale, tuck the tail, push the floor away, rounding your spine. Inhale, cow. Exhale, cat. Inhale, cow. And exhale to a more neutral shape. And then from here, imagine you've got a great big pencil coming out of your tailbone, and you're going to draw a little circle on the wall behind you. Try to make it a nice, even, smooth circle. And you might notice that one side wants to work and the other side doesn't. Or one side of your circle is round and whole and the other side's a flattened letter D. And you can make that little circle bigger if you're finding you're able to smooth it out. And then go the opposite way. You might want to come back to your small circle here as you switch directions. Making the circle a little bit bigger. Doesn't have to be a huge movement. If there's a little bit of discomfort, that's okay, but you don't want it to be pain. Sometimes if we've held certain tensions or positions in our body for a long time, you can maybe misinterpret that sensation. And then making your circle smaller and coming back to center. Coming onto your knees or your shin bones, sit back onto your heels. Let your hands rest onto your thighs. Stick your tail way back behind you and actively contract your low back muscles. Ribs may flare out a little here. And then use your exhale to tuck the tail underneath you, rounding your spine. So we're in cat-cow again. We're just in a different orientation to gravity. So rocking forward and back. It's interesting to feel the differences in sensation here. I just did cat-cow on my hands and knees, but here I feel different. And that's because the way that the weight of gravity is landing on my body has changed, and my nervous system is responding differently. My muscles are working in a different way because of where those poles of gravity are sort of landing in the body. And you could, if you needed to, make the movement much smaller if it was, if you were having any pain. Really what I'm just feeling is that my muscles really want to quiver and shake in this shape, a lot more so than they did in the hands and knees version. And that's just usually, waking up neuromuscular units that you haven't used in a little while. And coming back to land on your hands and knees once again. Walk your hands over to the left side of your mat. You're going to be in cat-cow. Our hips are going to stay, or shin bones are going to stay where they are, but the arms are going to walk over to the left. And then we'll lift up through the tail, lengthen the belly, send the heart forward. Look forward, take a breath in, and a breath out, tucking the tail, rounding your spine. Inhale, cow. Exhale, cat. Inhale, cow. And exhale, cat. Inhale, cow. And exhale, cat. Inhale, neutral. Walking your hands through center, come over to the right side now. Inhale, cow, lifting the tail, lengthening the belly, shoulders draw down the back. Exhale, round your spine, tuck your chin. Inhale, cow. Exhale, cat. And take a few more here. And walk your hands back to center. And I'm going to come right up onto my shin bones here. And then just simply shift the weight a little heavier, hands onto hips, shift the weight a little heavier to the left foot, step your right foot forward. Feel free to come from a down dog if you're feeling that today. And then hands on hips. Begin to stick your bum way back and exaggerate the curve in your lower back. Sort of dumping or tipping your bowl the pelvic bowl forward, ribs coming forward and sort of kind of just splaying out, low back contracting. And then the opposite of that, we're going to really tuck the tail, squeeze the glute, pull the front ribs in. You probably immediately get a stretch through this front hip flexor. If we're way forward like this, you may not. So trying to keep your hip stacked over your knee, squeeze your bum, lift up through the front of the ribs. Take a big breath in and a full breath out. And then find the sweet spot in between those two shapes. Not spilling forward completely, not completely flattening the low back. Find the space in between where there is a subtle curve in the low spine. There's a little bit of a lengthening happening through the hip flexor, and you feel like you could hang on to this shape for a moment and feel nice and solid. From here, sweep the arms wide and high. Interlace the hands, press up through the heels of the hand, take a little side bend over to the right. Really push down through the left shin bone as you lift up through the whole left side. Reaching out through the heel of your left hand, breathing in and breathing out. And stacking your spine back up to center. Release your hands back onto your hips. Step back through the right foot. Step forward through the left. Coming into that 90-90 shape. Now again, exaggerate because one hip flexor could be significantly tighter than the other. So we're going to stick our bums back, send our ribs forward, chest forward. Not an ideal shape for this stretch. So and actually just take a moment for fun and just see when you come forward and you've got that real dip in the low back and the ribs are flaring out and the tailbone's reaching back, you're not feeling much of a stretch in your hip flexors. And now the opposite of that, really scoop the bum under you, draw those front ribs in, engage the belly, and you'll feel a more significant stretch in that right hip flexor. But we also don't want to exhaust the nervous system with this work. So we're going to just find a little bit of a tip back of the tail. So it's a little more neutral. You should still feel a stretch in the front of your right hip flexor, but we're not expending so much energy tightening everything up that we exhaust ourselves and don't get an ideal opening through that hip. So inhaling, reaching the arms wide and high, lift up through the arms, press the palms up towards the ceiling, push a little heavier into your right shin bone, and then side bend to the left. Slowing the breath down. Always feel free with this too, because it is also a balance. You can always take your hand onto a table or a wall or something like that if needed. And pushing down through that right shin bone, continuing to squeeze just enough from the right glute. And coming back to center. Hands come back down onto your hips. We're going to switch sides once again. Before we come up with the right foot, come back down onto hands and knees. And then from here, knees going to stay where it is. I should have mentioned, feel free to throw a blanket under your knees. I'm sure you guys all know that by now. I'm going to turn my left ankle out a little bit. So the whole foot's going to kind of come over to the left side of my mat. I'll walk my hands a little over to the left. And then as I step my right foot forward, I'm going to take a much wider stance than I normally do to just widen the base so that I have a little more balance in this shape. You can even turn your toe out on that right side because it's not about this leg at all. So from here, again, I'm going to find that sweet spot between squeezing the left glute and dipping into the front of my, dipping into my low back, I should say. So finding that little squeeze, that lift up through the ribs. Inhale the arms up. side bend to the right. Now you might not go as far this time. We've just changed the shape of our hip flexor, our psoas muscle. We're working with one of the other fiber directions now. And if that fiber direction is a lot more restricted in your body, then it's going to restrict your movement here. Continuing to use the breath. Stack your spine back up. You can stick your bum back, walk your hands back down onto the floor. Right shin bone steps back. Left foot steps forward. Actually, yes, you can totally do that internal rotation of your back leg with the left foot forward. So my ankle's just coming off the mat to the right a little bit. And then walk your hands to the right, come back up. Paying attention, of course, also to what's happening in your knees. So this side of my body is not wanting to go into as much internal rotation. So I'm going to honor that and just not take it there. Because if I don't listen and I push it, maybe I hurt my knee, and I don't want that. So inhaling the arms up. Exhaling, side bend to the left. Slowing the breath down. And coming back up, arms sweep down, walk hands back onto the floor, and step your left foot back. From here, let's come all the way down onto the belly. And you could take stacked fists or a block or stacked palms and lay your head down. I'm going to try to keep my head up a little bit so that you guys don't get that muffly sound. And starting off with just a little wiggle and a sway. And I don't usually use momentum in my movements and try to slow things down. But for this, I really want to just get all those little joints in the low back, mid back moving. This isn't about strength. It's just about mobility a little. And just wagging the hips. Another option would be to bend the knees and let the legs sway from side to side. And then release your feet back onto the floor. Push down a little heavier through the top of your right foot. And then lift your left leg, lengthen it up, point your toe to the back of the room, keep all that length, and then land it back onto the floor. And then press down through the top of your left foot, squeeze and lift the right leg up, lengthen it out as much as you can, and lowering it back down. Keep all of that length, pressing the ankle creases and the hip creases into the floor a little bit heavier. And think of your glutes rounding back just a little bit towards your heels. So I'm squeezing my bum here. Keeping my legs really active. Finding a subtle squeeze of the inner thighs and inner shins towards one another. And then from here, I'm going to walk up onto my forearms. Elbows are underneath the shoulders. Forearms are glued to the floor. Keep all the strength in your legs and then drag the forearms back. They're not really going to move anywhere. They're just kind of sliding on their own skin. As you reach your heart forward, look forward for Sphinx pose. back down. You can rest your head on your hands or your stacked fists. You can sway the hips from side to side or bend the knees and sway from side to side. And release the feet back onto the floor. One more time, we'll find length in each leg. Firm up through the legs. I'm pushing my ankle creases and hip creases towards the floor. Kneecaps are lifted off of the mat. Bum scoop down towards the tail or the heels. Walk one elbow underneath the shoulder, then the other. Draw the shoulders down the back. Look forward. Slowly breathing. And lowering the chest back down. Just here for a moment. You can take another little wiggle through the hips. And then from here, coming back up, coming back into our Sphinx shape through the upper body. This time I'm going to spin my right forearm in on about a 45-degree, roll up onto my right hip a little, bend my left leg, and reach back for the top of my left foot. From here, you can come back to rest the head onto the floor, and you can pull that left heel towards your sit bone. Slowly release that left foot. Come back to center just for a moment. Take a little moment to pause and feel the difference from side to side. My quads are really tight from biking. My son and I have been doing a lot of biking. And I can feel that my left hip is landing more easily on the mat already just from that 30-second stretch. So coming back up onto forearms, elbows under shoulders, elbows under shoulders. Knees can stay where they've been this whole time. Left forearm's going to turn in on a 45. Roll up onto your left hip a little, bend your right knee, reach back for the top of your foot. I've grabbed it from the inside here, which you can do. That's usually when we're doing different variations though. I'm not worried so much about stretching my shoulders today, so my right shoulder's rolling in a little. That's totally fine for what I'm doing. Hanging onto the top of my foot, I'm going to come back down to rest the head. So although this is it's not a completely passive shape, it is, it's passive in the effect of me pulling on the top of my foot, using that to lengthen the front of my quad or front of my thigh, but I'm still actively squeezing my right glute. And slowly releasing that right foot. Come back to rest your head on your forearms for a moment. And then let gravity take over here. Let the body sink into the floor as you slow the breath down. And walk the hands underneath you. Press yourself up. Sit your hips back. You could sit right back into a child's pose if you wanted, but I don't like going from extension into flexion too quickly with the low back. So I'm going to stick my butt up and then walk my hands forward, more like a puppy pose rather than a full child's pose. And then walk one hand onto the floor and then the other. I'm going to sit up onto your hips or onto your heels. We're going to do a little dance, not a full-on dance, but we're going to take our hands onto our hips and then we're going to pretend we're hula hooping. So it's kind of similar to that cat quadruped shape where we were circling the tailbone. But again, we're doing a similar shape with a different relationship to gravity because it's really amazing actually if I'm assessing somebody in the treatment room, their posture, it might indicate when they're standing up that they have, we'll say like a sway back as what most people call it, or a exaggerated lumbar curve or low back curve, and then that might when they are on the table, that might not be the case because the relationship to gravity is a little bit different. So bodies are cool. So I'm going to begin to hula hoop in the opposite direction now. I used to do martial arts, and my teacher's teacher told her that if he could only do one exercise for the rest of his life, it would be hula hips. So we did this. We usually did it from standing, which we could do right now. But this is a pretty similar shape. But he, having this mobility in through the hips and low spine are so important in that Kung Fu lineage and being able to access the energy center of the lower abdomen, called Dantian in Chinese martial arts. That was the most important thing to him. And then this is a guy who could do like fingertip push-ups, one-armed push-ups, no problem. This was the most important exercise to him, if that says anything about hip and low back mobility work. And then coming back to center. From here, I completely forgot to tell you at the beginning to grab a chair for your Shavasana, but you can pause me. So isn't that wonderful? So go grab yourself a chair. You can pause this right now. I'm just going to step over here and grab one. And take your chair to the end of your mat. You guys have done this with me before. I think if you've done all of my videos, you have. If you've been in class, you've definitely done it. Come on to your back and then swing your legs up and over top of the chair. So if this chair was so tall that my feet were sticking up like this, or even like this, and I couldn't land them and allow that natural curve to come into my low back, then I would elevate the hips on some stacked towels or blankets. Sorry, not just the hips, your whole torso. So get like a couple of big blankets or towels underneath the length of your spine and low back, just so that you're not squished up and unable to breathe fully. From here, begin to let the shin bones get heavier and heavier onto the support. Continuing to slow the breath down. As you allow those shin bones to get heavier and heavier, let that translate into your thigh bones and all the way down into your pelvis and hips. Let those get heavier and sink into the floor. And letting that weight translate up into the spine, the ribs, and the shoulder blades. Deeply letting go. Letting the weight of the chest and arms, neck and head sink even heavier into the floor. And stay here and take as much time as you need in your Shavasana. Or you can slowly take the legs off the chair, roll to one side, and press yourself up. Come into a cross-legged seat or into a kneeling shape, finding a nice tall spine. Let the crown of your head just float up towards the ceiling, and the shoulders, the breath and ribs sink a little heavier. Prayer your hands at your heart. Bow to yourself and thank yourself for practicing and tuning into your body today. Namaste.